Thank you for the invite today. It's really great to be here. I was last here in 2011 when I was part of the European Commission's Design Leadership Board, and the Secretariat was Aalto University. And as in the introduction, prior to that, I was working at the UK Design Council. So my first experience of service design goes back to probably 2002, when I, at that time, became their head of knowledge, and we needed to build some materials to share about the future of design, and service design was one of the topics that we started to build knowledge on. And so I'm a huge champion and fan of the work of Service Design Network. I think it's an exceptional network that bringing together both the commercial, the academic, and the design practitioners in a way that is quite unusual. So I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that I've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years, where I've been taking design tools and design ways of working into new spaces, new environments, and new places. And by way of my background, I originally studied industrial design. So I did a foundation in art. I then did 4 years in industrial design. I then did my PhD in virtual reality, looking at digital communication and the three-dimensional virtual world, before more recently doing a master's in public policy at the London School of Economics. So I've tried to kind of, you could call me a hybrid. I start and I come from a design point of view, but I've needed, as each world I've moved into, I always say that like 1 degree of separation from your specialism feels like a whole new world. So for me, each time I've done that, I've needed to kind of retrain and relearn. And I think one of the core messages in this field, as it is with all fields, is how can we get better at learning and trying out new ways of working and adapting, adopting those that work. So this is my office, not the telephone box. The building next to it, overlooking Big Ben. I ran past there on Sunday, so if you've seen me about, if you're seeing I'm limping a little bit, it's because I ran my very first marathon. There's nothing efficient about running a marathon. It required a huge amount of empathy. I mean, you know, thousands of, if you've ever run a marathon, you don't run it by yourself. It's a collective experience, and I totally resonated hearing the previous speaker about some of these things that we do that aren't rational. Why would you run 26 miles on a weekend? It's crazy. So I ran past here on Sunday, and I'm going to share with you what we've been doing within the UK government, using design, digital, and data science in new ways. So the space I operate and work within is policy. And some of you may have seen that we talk about policy designers. And someone said this was a world first. I'm not sure if that's true, but we're bringing design into new setting. And what is policy? So when I think about policy, I think about the way that 90% of design decisions are not made by designers in terms of how we live our life. Angela Dumas did some research on this, and so much of our designed world doesn't touch the hand of a designer. So this is Soho in central London. And you can see here 3 parking spaces. The first one says doctor. The second one says disabled. Question to you, what does the third one say? You can't read it, obviously, unless you really, unless you've been here. So this is the prime location parking in London. In London, you can get fined just for breathing. So, you know, these are high-value spaces, and we have 3 different spaces. Any guesses as to what the third one might be? It could be, it isn't. Say again? Cab? No. There are some special dedicated cab spaces, but this isn't one of them. Over here? Diplomat. I like it. What was the other one up there? Disabled doctor. Very good. Okay. It reads electric. So one of the things I think that policymakers do is they make these big decisions on how we live our lives. And they have to weigh up questions about the kinds of values and the kinds of society that we want to be. And they have to make priority decisions, trade-offs between a doctor, the disabled, and the future of electric vehicles. And in this case, they put them evenly. So shortly, if you were to walk from here 5 minutes or so, you come to my office. You will have all seen my office before, if you have watched James Bond. So it featured in Spectre, and Daniel Craig walked through the office here. We're on the top floor. And it's a very austere building. And when they filmed over the weekends, we could see where we could all go and do selfies. But it really struck me that when they filmed the interior, they didn't show our building anymore. They created a stage set, a prop. And they made it look like it was from the 1950s. And, this looks nothing like my actual office. And so, the sort of diplomatic, historic element. I mean, I don't know anyone with a desk that looks like that. The inside of our office looks like this. It's open plan. It's kind of as everyone else's office, but that just isn't cool enough for James Bond. And you can't imagine James Bond, with the Post-it notes, trying to work out the next bit. So this was part of the problem. So here we have in the photo, we have one of our top ministers working with the service design team in our trade department and the policy lab. We help them do a whole series of work, working with businesses on export futures. So the methods are very different to perhaps how you might expect within government. And it's often the case that people think of government as being quite traditional and bureaucratic. And in some places that still exists. But actually, I think as Birgit was saying, there are actually hundreds of designers within the UK government. And for the first time, we're having a global conference in July. So you'll all be very welcome to come to London and share with us some of the things that we're doing. So I'm going to talk you through, there's basically 3 diagrams that I want to share with you today, and a whole bunch of slides just to kind of take us on a bit of a journey to and from those diagrams. I think in pictures. One of the diagrams I've never shown anyone before, ever, so you're first to see it. It also happens to be my most complicated diagram to date, so I'm sorry about that. So what do we do in the policy lab? So we work across the whole of government. Policymakers can come to us, and they typically come to us when they get stuck, when they want to work in new ways, when they have intractable problems that are too complex, when they have multiple stakeholders. And their usual way of working isn't working for them anymore. And we pretty much take them through 5 steps. And I won't go into this in detail because you can read a lot of this online. But it speaks to a lot of the things that Birgit was saying before. The policy lab sits between strategy and implementation. And I think in a world where things move very rapidly, the distinction between strategy and implementation just becomes much less significant. In some areas, it's still really, really crucial. So if you're building something that takes 20, 30 years to construct, a new transport system, then you need that kind of strategic front end. But if you're building a website or some digital-enabled technologies, then you obviously are working much more quickly, so the pace of change. But in many of the areas we work on, they're usually about 20, 30-year horizons. And so we spend a lot of time in that framing. What is the question we're here to answer? And as civil servants, we receive that from ministers. So politicians will give us a manifesto, and our job is to interpret that, to guide them through how they might best deliver that. Humanizing, really important, because we serve citizens, and their voice is really crucial. And obviously they vote for their politicians, but then what happens when it comes to implementing those policies, and how can we involve them much more actively, so they don't just get every number of years spoken to about a manifesto, they actually get actively involved. We spend a lot of time on evidence, and in my experience as a designer over more than 20 years, I've never had to meet such a high standard of evidence as I do within government, and you would expect that. These are topics that can affect world markets, they're topics that can change people's lives, it is really crucial that we are evidence-based. And so I've needed to myself take on board new analytical tools to make a case for how design might work. I use the word disrupting carefully because I don't think, and I hope, that the people we work with don't feel disrupted. If you rock up to a client and say, it's going to be great, we're going to disrupt you, that is the last thing they often want. And so a lot of our disruption is much more subtle. It's guiding them through what is actually probably more often than not a disruptive environment that they find themselves in and helping them make sense of that. And then finally, moving into the more of the sort of from the strategy to delivery, who are our co-conspirators? How do we create a shared roadmap? And how do we co-design and co-create and find ways to enable change to happen? So this is our approach. Every project, we've run 40 projects now in government in 4 years, worked with thousands of civil servants. And it's everything from space security and high technology through to social housing and crime and things like that. So it's hugely expansive. So we're using a design approach on whole new areas that I've never known design be used in. So our toolkit, again, is online. It involves some of these things, and it's a mixture of design, digital, and data. So we talk about the 3 Ds of change. So it's not purely design, and it's certainly not singularly service design. It is a broader hybrid toolkit. But you recognize, obviously, within this, many of the things that you will already be using. The other thing to bear in mind with this is that some tools just didn't exist, so we had to make them. And I think that's very much a design quality, that you start with a certain toolkit, you kind of evolve it a bit, but sometimes you just hit things that you need to make a brand new tool for. And so in a couple of areas, we've needed to do that, where those tools don't exist, and they're what we call firsts for government. So just to give you a couple of pictures. This technique we use a lot. We borrowed it from MindLab, which is hopes and fears, and we pretty much kick off nearly every workshop. This works. I've never found this technique not work, help people to think about what is their utopia and what is their dystopia. What is their hope for the project or for the policy, and what do they fear most? And it's about getting that empathy in the room. It's about getting people to have the meeting in the room rather than outside. So what I tend to find happens is that we have really productive meetings. In the civil service, if I'm critical, I have seen it where people only speak in rank, starting with the most senior person, and then down to the more junior people don't speak at all. And sometimes you'll have meetings with 2 tiers, so the more junior people are definitely not even at the table, so they can't speak. So this whole thing about how do you really get people to connect, be empathic, and use their collective intelligence, for us, everyone has a card, everyone has a say, and we flatten the hierarchy. So diagram number 1. Our tools are not our practice. One of the things that we do is we do a whole bunch of projects, but they are about doing these pinpoint inquiries to make a much bigger transition. So we borrow from the language of the sustainable transitions, strategic niche management. I don't know how many people are familiar with this as a model. Can you raise your hands if you're familiar with strategic niche management? Okay, so yeah, I'm really worried now because this diagram is, this is the complicated diagram. Okay, so this is adapted from Geets and Schott, 2007. They talked about the fact that every revolution in history, when you look back on it, is actually a series of small incremental steps. So the thing to think about when you look at this diagram is if you're moving over time, each one of these little stars is a different project, is a different exploration. This is what designers do. This is our portfolio. Over time, you can actually create a shift, a fundamental shift in the system. And it's not to say I'm going to disrupt you immediately. It's going to say I'm going to disrupt you gently. You may not even notice you're being disrupted, but over time, we will move to a new place. So for us, this is about understanding the macro, the zooming out, the scaffolding on which we want to create, and then being really focused on the practical step-by-step actions that we might take to get there. So I think all this will be shared. But for us, this is about us transitioning our ways of being to adapt to new technologies, the circular economy, aging, broader questions of health and well-being, so that we can start to see and create the change that we want. And for us, this is a mixture of networks, experiments, patterns, and actually understanding how they work, and this emergence of new knowledge. So this is my most complicated diagram. Everything gets easier after here. Okay, so for those of you who are perhaps more new to service design and some of these ways of working, one thing we started with in government was the idea of the prototype. The prototype is a good way to test things, and we use the word in government because we knew they weren't using it. And we could then measure it 4 years later. Do people talk about prototyping now and they didn't before? So this was an important part of us knowing if we were actually landing any impact. So for example, with the police, this was the start of the meeting at 8 in the morning. The police officer, who's the chief police, everyone was very excited, but they just, they're in a usual meeting mode. And then this is the same meeting later on in the day, when they were actively, practically building new solutions. In fact, somebody went outside Buckingham Palace and role-played getting mugged and attacked and their bag stolen. So it was a bit strange because we kind of thought the police might come and try and solve our fake crime with a criminologist pretending to be a victim. It was quite surreal. But in each of the projects, we do these low-fidelity testing. So this is testing for identifying numbers around national insurance numbers. What would that look like on a phone, just using phone board? Very simple, but everyone kind of understands that if you get it right in the early stages, it costs a lot less than if you get it wrong. One of my personal passions would be to so in England, all of our hospitals are written in Latin. When I had my first baby, I arrived late, and the Latin, I was like under a lot of pressure. It was not easy for me. So it would be nice to have like a legible hospital that is not written in Latin. And whilst on my list, I think also toilets that have the right number of space for women would be another one that we could do. So there's some really basic things that we still haven't quite got right. Here's some prototypes that we're doing and just mock-ups that we're doing about the future of housing and new rental systems. And again, just very straightforward, simple. And we have to put on things not a government proposal, because when you put things out in the world, on Twitter or on a blog, then people just assume this is government policy. So we have to be really careful about not trying to create a slight fear that this is actually real already, when much of it is speculation. I'm including this diagram, which was created by Lucy Kimball, Professor Kimball. She spent a year with our policy lab, and one of the things she was interested in is what is design bringing that's new and different to perhaps the randomized control trials and the behavioral insights and nudge unit. So she created this kind of diagram to try and break that down. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, other than to say that there are some really significant differences. And when policymakers and governments want to work in new ways, these are all part of their toolkit. The work that we do with design in early stages is much more about softer experimentation, exploration. It's not an A-B, so comparing one with the other, and it's not downstream. So it's very early stage. And I'm going to show you one example that just explains end-to-end a little bit more how that works. But I think if these slides are being shared, you should be able to get this in more detail. And Lucy's written about this in a number of papers, so if you're interested, do go and have a read. So for me, policy making is the art of the possible. It's not the optimum or the best, it's what you can deliver. And what we want to do is stop people being very myopic about, oh, well, the future is drones, or the future is, so these very simple, singular ideas. We want to open up possibilities. So we've been introducing speculative design techniques within the UK government. It's come out of the work done in Raby at the Royal College of Art and many other places. And it's really about this opening up of possibilities to say, there's not just one way that the future is going to come at us, and we need to be prepared for other possibilities. And so in terms of actually making policy deliverable, because it's all very well having an idealistic idea of what the future should be like, but if it never happens, who cares? So we think there are a number of factors you have to bring together, and these are the policy dynamics. You've got your institutions of polity. Now, those of you who are all over blockchain, for example, will understand that blockchain has potential to radically change the institutions of polity, all institutions, because it creates new networks of trust and transactional trust networks. But we have already these institutions, and they're a really key part of how we deliver this kind of change. There's the art of politics, our politicians who are making those decisions in those rooms that we've already seen. But there's also the craft of policy making, which traditionally has been quite empirical and rationalistic, and increasingly needs to be more creative and more empathic. The science of management that pervades many of our public services is another aspect of how do you deliver within these frameworks. And then, of course, the pragmatics often of the frontline delivery, where you have a perfect plan, but the people who are delivering the service just don't follow it. So we want to build all of these together, and this kind of takes me to my next diagram, which is that within the Policy Lab, we think of ourselves as evidence curators. And for me, this is probably the biggest distinction between the design mindset and the policy mindset. So on this side of the ladder, this is all kind of retrospective. This is like what has already happened. This is what's happened, what is happening, and why did it happen. So looking backwards into the future. And these are the tools that many policymakers use, and many business decision makers use, and many rational people would see as core. And the problem with that is it's all founded on best practice, what has been proven. The problem is much of the future is unproven. It is next practice. And designers intuitively get this because we're constantly making these new things and we're building them. But it is surprising to me always how hard that is for others to really understand. And so I thought I'd put it on a ladder so they could start to see. So as you move through, you then get into what will happen, into the space of foresight, which again has got traction in government. And then the top right, which is the highest level of next practice with the maximum amount of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is the kind of looking out to making it happen, in effect. How can we make it happen? How can we prototype it? How can we build it? How can we deliver it? Brand new things that have never been even thought of before. So speculative design, and I usually don't include all the tools on this model because it's already got lots of things, but I've included them here for you because I think that it probably just explains these different types of technique in context. So, just by way of the case study that I wanted to share, the future of aging. So this is like a global problem, and we use speculative design, that top right-hand step, throughout this project. Just to give you an example of the bottom retrospective step, this is what we started with. So the scientists have gone out, the Government Office for Science, and consulted for 18 months with top academics from around the whole country and around the world. They had run evidence sessions about what the data tells us about the future of aging. They had also produced a 200,000-word report, and some people hadn't read it. In fact, many of the policymakers they were trying to affect hadn't read it other than the summary. And so this amazing knowledge was just invisible to the system. The system wasn't going to change. It was, a system of people needs to engage with this material, not just receive a book. So what we did is with our design team, we started to take out that data, visualize it, and we built an evidence safari that included real personas come out of the real evidence. So it's all evidence-based, but it's presented in a way that we could then use in a workshop setting. And there is a video online that you can see that shows this in action. But it was amazing to see the interactions between the different parts of the system when we brought different kinds of policymakers together and started to map what the ideas come of that. And then these design principles led us into, in effect, virtual reality simulations of future that were, again, evidence-based, came out of the real evidence. So this is engaging with users, looking at a visualization of the future of a robot repair shop. what would it be like if you had a robot repair shop and you needed your AI fixing and you had to go to the shop? Maybe you would or wouldn't have a shop. This is all a question. So these different touch points came out of the evidence, and we could start to get people to respond. That leads me to my third and final diagram, really, which is that I should say within the policy lab, there's about 10 people. We have 2 ethnographers that help us really understand the thick data of the lived experience, so user research. We have 2 designers, and the rest are policy leads. So, and there's 1 researcher. So we're kind of a hybrid team ourselves. But we work within this bigger system of government. And what we're trying to do is start to encourage policymakers to realize there's a much bigger toolkit than they probably think. So these are the main ways that government works, from laws and regulation to funding taxes that we all love, providing and commissioning services. So a lot of service design will be embedded within that as multi-million and billion-pound spending of government, through to the softer stuff about, well, how do you keep the system working and system stewardship that people like Christian Basson have spoken about. So we took these and we're starting to try and encourage people not go straight to law, because it takes a long time and it's very slow, but to start to use the broader toolkit. So that led us to our 28 levers for change. The toolkit starts to point to all the different techniques that are at the hand of government. And I just want to share it with you because sometimes, well, often when designers join our team, they say to us, what is policy? And when we have started to use these, we've got a couple of systems maps as well, it starts to reveal to people as they move that 1 degree of separation from their existing knowledge, this whole new world of policy is far more complex than people realize. So these are all things that people might do. Let's just pick out a couple. You've got the convening power, so your minister or your prime minister or your president might stand on the steps of their house or their office and say, let's do something, or let's make a moon mission. Through to, there are things in here, choice architecture on the far right, the nudge unit, and then down into kind of law and so forth. So there are many different ways that government can operate. We've turned this into a toolkit, of course, and we're now testing that out. So about 3 weeks ago, we did a session on the future of shipping. So this is marine autonomy. You've heard of autonomous cars. That's probably the next box in that electric vehicle. It'd be the autonomous vehicle parking. Autonomous ships. Who knew? I didn't, but apparently there are. And we got 100 people together from around the world, the ports, the container ships, the insurers, the innovators, the designers of the ships, the whole lot, the policymakers. And we used that tool to help them see how can government create the right kind of environment for the future of shipping. And then finally, really, I'm just showing my last slide, which is to this point about complexity, which many of the policymakers I work with understand implicitly that they work in a complex system. But it took our design team to say, what does that actually look like? And with post-it notes, they started to map the system, and then they built this map, and now we've done a video where you can actually fly through the complexity of the UK government system. And the policymakers found that to be incredibly powerful and insightful and useful, and have asked us if we can share that much more broadly. So the future, I think, is, as we know, it involves a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. There will be next practice, and we need people to come up with new ways of thinking. But we also need people to help us navigate that and bring the human dimension and to be creative. And so for me, I think we're just in the foothills of the way that design can play a profound role in shaping the way that government operates and affecting change within that 90% of decisions that, to date, designers haven't touched. Thank you.